What if the greatest battles in history weren't won by sheer strength or numbers, but by minds sharper than swords? Picture this: ancient commanders standing before vast armies, not with reckless force, but with strategies so clever they're still studied today. This is the hidden world of the art of war in antiquity, where deception became a weapon, psychology shaped empires, and unconventional tactics turned the tide of war. From Sun Tzu's timeless wisdom to Hannibal's daring Alpine crossing, these leaders didn't just fight, they outthought their enemies in ways that still echo across centuries. How did they do it, and why do their strategies hold secrets that even modern generals rely on? Strap in, we're about to unravel the mysteries of warfare's most brilliant minds, and you might just walk away with lessons that go far beyond the battlefield. The battlefields of antiquity were nothing like the chaotic clashes we see in modern war films. No explosions, no machine guns, just disciplined formations, perfectly timed maneuvers, and the sheer will to outthink an opponent. Take the Greeks, for instance. Their legendary Phalanx wasn't just a wall of shields. It was a masterpiece of cohesion where every soldier moved as one, turning a simple advance into an unstoppable force. But here's the twist: some of history's most decisive victories didn't come from brute strength alone. The Romans mastered the art of adaptability, reshaping their legions mid-battle to exploit gaps in enemy lines. And then there's Sun Tzu's The Art of War, which didn't just teach combat, it revealed how deception could win wars without a single drop of blood spilled. These weren't just armies, they were chess players on a grand scale, where terrain, weather, even the enemy's own arrogance became weapons. Why charge headlong when you could ambush from the hills? Why fight at all if you could starve a fortress into surrender? Every choice was calculated, every movement deliberate. And that's where the real genius lies, not in the clash of steel, but in the minds that turned the tide before the battle even began. Sun Tzu understood something most warriors missed: the real battlefield wasn't the dirt beneath their feet, but the fear and uncertainty in their enemy's mind. His writing didn't just outline tactics, it revealed how perception could be twisted into a weapon sharper than any blade. Take the empty fort strategy, where a general left city gates wide open, his soldiers hidden while he calmly played music atop the walls. The enemy, convinced it was a trap, retreated without a fight. This wasn't just a trick, it was theater, a performance designed to exploit doubt and the brilliance. These tactics didn't rely on resources or luck. They worked because Sun Tzu knew human nature. A feigned retreat could turn confidence into recklessness. False intelligence could send armies marching in the wrong direction. Even something as simple as lighting extra campfires at night could make a small force appear vast. Today, these same principles echo far beyond war. Business leaders use misdirection in negotiations. Athletes fake out opponents with deceptive plays. Politicians shape narratives to control public perception. The lesson isn't about lying, it's about mastering the art of influence. Because whether on an ancient battlefield or a boardroom, the person who controls the story often controls the outcome. Hannibal's march across the Alps wasn't just a military maneuver. It was a stroke of psychological genius. Picture 37 war elephants, thousands of soldiers, and a journey through frozen mountain passes so treacherous even locals avoided them. Rome never saw it coming. Their entire strategy relied on defending the coast, expecting an invasion by sea. Instead, Hannibal chose the impossible route, turning geography itself into a weapon of surprise. The cost was brutal: bitter cold, avalanches, and staggering losses, but the payoff was priceless. By emerging in northern Italy, he shattered Rome's illusion of safety, forcing them to scramble defenses against an enemy they'd assumed was still miles away. This wasn't just about mobility, it was about rewriting the rules of war. Hannibal understood that victory often goes to the side willing to defy expectations. His elephants, though few survived, became symbols of unstoppable momentum, their mere presence sowing panic in Roman ranks. Modern strategists still study this campaign not for its brute force but for its sheer nerve. Because sometimes the greatest advantage isn't in numbers or weapons, it's in doing what no one else would dare to try. The Trojan horse stands as one of history's most enduring symbols, not just of deception, but of how imagination can overpower brute strength. Think about it, after 10 years of bloody stalemate outside Troy's walls, the Greeks didn't win by charging harder or building taller siege towers. They won by crafting a story their enemies wanted to believe. A giant wooden horse left behind as a gift, hiding warriors inside. It was a gamble that played on human nature itself. Troy's mistake wasn't just bringing the horse inside their gates, it was assuming victory looked like surrender. The Greeks understood something deeper. When force fails, psychology thrives. This wasn't merely a trick, it was theater on an epic scale, leveraging pride and ritual against the defenders. Even today, the phrase Trojan horse defines any attack that disguises itself as harmless, from computer viruses to corporate takeovers. But here's the real lesson. The Greeks didn't just exploit Troy's curiosity. They exploited their exhaustion. After a decade of war, the Trojans craved an end, a sign of divine favor. The horse offered that illusion, proving that the most effective strategies often target not just the body but the mind. In that way, the wooden horse wasn't just a weapon, it was a mirror reflecting how easily hope can be weaponized when the stakes are high enough. Scorched earth tactics reveal one of warfare's darkest truths. Sometimes survival means destroying what you cherish most. The Scythians, nomadic warriors of the steppes, perfected this brutal strategy when Persia's mighty Darius the Great marched against them with an army rumored in the hundreds of thousands. Instead of meeting his forces head-on, they vanished into the wilderness, burning their own croplands and poisoning wells as they retreated. Darius found himself chasing shadows across a barren wasteland, his troops starving as supply lines stretched thin. Every step forward became a lesson in frustration. Conquering empty land gains nothing when there's no food to pillage, no villages to occupy. Within months, the once proud Persian invasion crumbled into a humiliating retreat. But here's what makes this tactic so chillingly effective. It weaponizes time itself. An invader's strength lies in momentum, while scorched earth grinds their advance to a halt. Modern parallels abound, from Russia's withdrawal from Ukraine's Kherson region in 2022, where they demolished critical infrastructure, to corporate maneuvers where companies deliberately devalue assets to deter hostile takeovers. The strategy forces a simple question: how much are you willing to lose today to deny your enemy victory tomorrow? It's not just about destruction, it's about control. By choosing when and where devastation falls, even the outnumbered can dictate the terms of the fight. The Scythians understood this power, turning their homeland into a trap where hunger and exhaustion became deadlier than any sword. Few tactics mess with an enemy's instincts more brutally than the feigned retreat. Picture this: a Mongol cavalry charge suddenly collapses, warriors scattering in what looks like panic, only for the pursuing army to find themselves riding straight into a carefully prepared kill zone. The brilliance, it wasn't just about running away, it was about weaponizing the enemy's own arrogance. Nomadic cultures like the Huns and Mongols elevated this trick to an art form, understanding something fundamental: humans chase what they think is weak. A disorganized retreat triggers a primal response, the thrill of victory, the urge to finish off a wounded foe. But that's exactly when the trap snaps shut. At the Battle of Kalka River in 1223, the Mongols used this very playbook, baiting a coalition of ruse princes into chasing them for days, stretching their forces thin. Then came the pivot, wheeling around with fresh troops hidden in reserve, slaughtering exhausted enemies who'd abandoned their own formations in their hunger for pursuit. What makes this more than just a clever ambush is the psychological layer. The retreat wasn't merely a ruse, it was a performance designed to provoke overconfidence, turning discipline into recklessness. Even today, echoes of this tactic appear everywhere, from guerrilla warfare, where insurgents lure troops into unfamiliar terrain, to cybersecurity, where hackers deliberately leave clues to draw investigators into digital dead ends. The lesson transcends time. The most dangerous opponent isn't the one who fights hardest, but the one who lets you think you've already won. History often frames the Greek phalanx and Roman legion as rivals, two iconic systems clashing in a battle of rigidity versus ingenuity. At first glance, the Greek approach seemed flawless. Soldiers standing shoulder to shoulder, shields interlocked, spears protruding like a steel thicket. This was unity perfected, a single, unstoppable force where breaking one link meant breaking the entire chain. Yet that very strength concealed a fatal flaw. At the Battle of Cynocephaly, Roman legions didn't confront the Macedonian phalanx head-on. Instead, they exploited its lack of maneuverability, slipping cohorts into gaps when uneven terrain disrupted the Greeks' perfect lines. Suddenly, the mighty phalanx became a lumbering giant, vulnerable to attacks from all sides. The Romans didn't just win through brute force, they redesigned warfare itself. Their manipular system organized soldiers into smaller, mobile units called maniples, each capable of pivoting, retreating, or reinforcing as needed. Picture a chessboard where every piece could transform mid-game. A phalanx moved like a single pawn, the legion moved like an entire set. This adaptability let Rome counter cavalry charges, navigate rough terrain, and wear down enemies through sheer endurance. Even their weapons reflected this philosophy. While Greek hoplites relied on long spears for frontal assaults, Roman gladius swords were shorter, deadlier in close quarters, a tool for the messy, unpredictable chaos of real combat. But the real lesson isn't about swords or shields. It's about how systems evolve under pressure. The phalanx dominated until it met an opponent that refused to play by its rules. Rome's genius wasn't just tactical, it was cultural. They absorbed ideas from every rival Samnite guerrillas, Carthaginian naval tactics, even Celtic chainmail. Where others saw threats, Rome saw textbooks. That relentless pragmatism built an empire, proving that the best strategies aren't carved in stone. They're written in the dirt, reshaped with every new challenge. Today, echoes of this clash play out everywhere, from tech giants pivoting to outmaneuver startups to emergency responders training for unpredictable crises. The takeaway: perfection is overrated. The phalanx was a masterpiece until the battlefield changed. The legion thrived because it never stopped changing with it. Water has no walls, yet ancient commanders turned seas into battlefields where deception ruled supreme. Consider the Battle of Salamis, where one man's cunning rewritten the fate of Greece. Persian King Xerxes watched from his golden throne as hundreds of his ships filled the horizon, outnumbering the Greeks nearly 3-1. But Themistocles, Athens' sly strategist, saw something Xerxes missed. The narrow straits between Salamis' rocky shores weren't a disadvantage, they were a weapon. By luring the Persian fleet into those tight channels, he turned their greatest strength against them. Massive ships jammed together, oars tangled like knotted rope, while Greek triremes, smaller, nimbler, darted between them like hawks picking apart a lumbering herd. The Persians couldn't swing their superior numbers in waters that barely allowed room to turn. This wasn't just a battle of ships, it was a masterclass in manipulating perception. Themistocles even sent a double agent to convince Xerxes the Greeks were in disarray, feeding the king's arrogance while his crews prepared for the perfect ambush. Centuries later, Admiral Sun Tzu would echo this tactic during Korea's Imjin War, using the jagged coastline to funnel Japanese fleets into his infamous crane wing formation, where overlapping arcs of cannon fire annihilated enemies who'd fallen for the lure of open water. The real lesson: superior technology or numbers mean little if your opponent controls the stage. Ancient admirals treated the sea like a chessboard, where currents and coastlines became tools to reshape the odds. Modern navies still study these engagements, recognizing that sometimes the deadliest weapon isn't a ship's hull, but the mind steering it into the right patch of waves. Siege warfare was less about battering down gates and more about outlasting an enemy's will to resist. Take Alexander the Great at Tyre, an island fortress so confident in its walls it laughed off his initial demand. But Alexander didn't just see a city surrounded by water, he saw a puzzle waiting to be solved. His solution: build a kilometer-long causeway from the mainland. Using rubble from the old coastal city, his army demolished stone by stone. For 7 grueling months, his men worked under constant arrow fire, their progress measured in inches. Yet this wasn't just brute labor, it was psychological warfare. Every new section of that mold chipped away at Tyre's sense of invincibility, proving no defense was truly unbreakable if creativity met persistence. Then there's Caesar at Alesia, where the Romans faced a nightmare scenario, encircled by Gallic reinforcements while besieging Vercingetorix's fortress. Instead of retreating, Caesar ordered his men to build not one, but 2 massive walls, one facing inward to starve the garrison, another outward to repel the relief force. This double circumvallation became a masterstroke of desperation and ingenuity, turning siege lines into a trap for both besieged and besiegers. Starvation did what swords couldn't, forcing surrender without a final bloody assault. But sieges weren't always about grand engineering. Sometimes the smallest tricks broke the stalemate. When the Assyrians tunneled beneath enemy walls to undermine foundations, they weaponized silence, digging in secret until stones suddenly crumbled under defenders' feet. Or consider the Byzantines, who once smuggled soldiers into Antioch inside grain sacks, their supply convoy, a Trojan horse in plain sight. These campaigns reveal a darker truth: sieges were battles against time as much as enemies. A general's greatest weapon wasn't just catapults or ramps, it was the ability to make his opponent believe resistance was futile. Because when hunger replaced courage and hope eroded faster than mortar, even the strongest walls fell from within. The Jewish Zealots didn't fight Rome's legions on open fields. They turned the very landscape into an ally. While imperial forces marched in perfect formations, these rebels struck from narrow mountain passes, ambushed supply convoys in the dead of night, and melted back into villages where every civilian might be hiding a dagger. This wasn't just hit-and-run warfare, it was a masterclass in grinding down a superior enemy through patience and unpredictability. Take the siege of Masada, where 1,000 zealots held off 15,000 Roman troops for months, using sheer cliffs to nullify the empire's numerical advantage. When defeat became inevitable, they chose destruction over surrender, a stark reminder that guerrilla fighters often wielded desperation as their sharpest weapon. But the Zealots weren't alone in rewriting the rules of engagement. In Hispania, the Lusitanian leader Viriathus became Rome's nightmare by refusing to fight conventionally. His forces would feign retreats, drawing legions into rugged terrain where their heavy armor became a liability, then attack from all sides with lightweight javelins and intimate knowledge of every ravine. The lesson: guerrilla warfare wasn't about winning battles. It was about making victory so costly that the enemy questioned whether it was worth fighting at all. Even more fascinating were the tactics of the Parthians, whose horse archers perfected the Parthian shot, firing arrows backward while seemingly in full retreat. This deadly deception turned pursuit into a death trap, proving that mobility and precision could outmaneuver brute force every time. Modern militaries still study these ancient insurgencies, recognizing that the principles of asymmetry using an enemy's strength against them haven't aged a day. Because when the odds are stacked against you, sometimes the smartest move isn't to stand your ground, but to disappear into the shadows and let the terrain do the fighting for you. War elephants weren't just beasts of burden. They were ancient tanks, their sheer size alone enough to send enemy lines crumbling before a single spear was thrown. Imagine facing a 3-ton creature clad in armor, tusks fitted with iron blades, trumpeting as it trampled through ranks like straw. The psychological impact was devastating. Horses reared in terror, infantry scattered, and even disciplined formations shattered under the onslaught. But here's the twist. These living weapons came with a perilous downside. A panicked elephant could turn on its own army, turning the battlefield into chaos with every stomp. At the Battle of Zama, Hannibal's elephants, spooked by Roman horns and javelins, rampaged backward, crushing Carthaginian troops instead of Romans. That unpredictability made them as much a liability as an asset, a reminder that nature couldn't be fully tamed, even for war. Yet elephants were just the beginning. Ancient commanders weaponized creatures great and small, turning the natural world into an arsenal. Take the bees of Themyscira. When besieged by Roman forces, the townspeople hauled hives onto their walls and hurled them at attackers, unleashing swarms of furious insects. Suddenly, climbing ladders became impossible as soldiers flailed at stinging chaos. The Romans retreated, defeated not by swords but by nature's own defenders. Even pigs became instruments of war, coated in pitch, set ablaze, and driven toward enemy lines. The sight of screaming, fire-engulfed animals charging at phalanxes was enough to disrupt even the most disciplined formations. What makes these tactics so fascinating isn't just their brutality, but their ingenuity. These weren't just random acts of desperation, they were calculated exploitations of instinct. Bees sting when threatened, pigs flee fire, elephants panic at unfamiliar noises. Ancient warriors didn't just fight with steel, they fought with psychology, leveraging the uncontrollable to tip the scales. Modern militaries still grapple with this lesson, whether using trained dolphins to detect underwater mines or studying insect drones for surveillance. The core idea remains unchanged. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't forged in a workshop. It's already out there, waiting for someone bold enough or cunning enough to harness it. In the smoke and chaos of ancient battlefields, faith often struck the first blow, not with swords but with whispers from the divine. The Oracle of Delphi didn't just predict futures, she shaped them. When Spartan kings sought her counsel before war, a single cryptic phrase could send armies marching or disband them entirely. Imagine the power of a priestess's words convincing thousands that victory was preordained, or worse, that the gods had turned against them. Sacred banners fluttering above ranks weren't mere decorations, they were psychological artillery. The Roman aquila, that golden eagle clutched in the standard-bearer's grip, wasn't just a symbol, it was a promise. Losing it in battle meant more than disgrace. It meant the legion had lost Jupiter's favor, a blow so devastating that some units disbanded rather than face the shame. But this wasn't just about motivation. Belief became a weapon wielded with chilling precision. When Alexander the Great marched into Egypt, he didn't just conquer, he pilgrimaged. By consulting the oracle at Siwa and having himself declared the son of Ammon, he didn't just gain legitimacy, he turned local priests into his propagandists. Suddenly, resistance wasn't just treason against a king, it was sacrilege against a god. The Carthaginians took this further, their child sacrifices to Baal Hammon, not just appeasing deities but broadcasting their desperation to allies and enemies alike. See how far we'll go to win. Even weather could be divine theater. At the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, Germanic tribes lured Roman legions into a storm, framing thunder as Wotan's wrath. 3 entire legions vanished that day, their bones left to rust among the oaks, a defeat so total it wasn't just a military loss but a crisis of faith. Because when omens and priests held as much sway as generals, war became as much about souls as soil. Today's athletes still touch lucky charms before games. Politicians quote scripture in speeches. The battlefield may have changed, but the human craving for higher meaning in struggle, that's one war tactic time hasn't erased. Alexander's conquests didn't just rely on brilliant tactics or fearless troops. They were built on something far less glamorous, the unrelenting grind of supply lines. While other generals starved their armies by overextending, Alexander turned logistics into an art form. His secret, a network of fortified depots stretching from Macedonia to India, each stocked with grain, weapons, and fresh horses. These weren't just storage pits, they were lifelines, allowing his forces to march thousands of miles without scavenging hostile lands. Consider the siege of Tyre while his engineers built that famed causeway. His fleet secured shipments of timber from Cyprus and food from Egypt, ensuring his men never fought on empty stomachs. But supply chains weren't just about food. Communication routes kept orders flowing across vast distances. Persian roads, repurposed by Alexander, became arteries for messengers relaying troop movements and intelligence. Unlike Darius, whose cumbersome baggage trains slowed his army to a crawl, Alexander's forces traveled light, relying on local allies and captured enemy stores to replenish their needs on the move. This wasn't just efficiency, it was psychological warfare. When he burned his own supply wagons after crossing the Hindu Kush, it sent a clear message: victory lay ahead, not in retreat. Rome later perfected this doctrine, their famed via militaris roads enabling legions to march 30 miles a day, while couriers raced news from frontier to capital in days, not weeks. Contrast that with Hannibal's Alpine crossing, where freezing temperatures and avalanches decimated his supply train before a single battle was fought. The lesson: the greatest generals' new campaigns weren't won on courage alone. They were won in the quiet calculus of grain stockpiles, the timing of reinforcements, and the unbroken rhythm of wagons rolling through the night. Even today, echoes of these ancient systems thrive. Modern militaries still speak of beans and bullets, while corporations optimize global supply chains like digital age Silk Roads. Because whether you're feeding an army or a smartphone factory, one truth remains: mastery over the unseen roads, warehouses, routes often decides who triumphs when the visible clash begins. Sun Tzu didn't just preach about spies, he built entire chapters of the art of war around their value, calling them the sovereign's most precious treasures. But ancient espionage was far more sophisticated than shadowy figures slipping through enemy camps. Take the Qin dynasty's use of sleeper agents. Merchants and diplomats planted years in advance to gather intelligence while living ordinary lives. These weren't just informants, they were human databases memorizing troop movements, grain storage locations, even the personal grudges of rival generals, details that could turn the tide when war finally erupted. The Romans elevated spycraft to a bureaucratic art. Their frumentarii, originally grain supply officers, doubled as imperial couriers and covert operatives, carrying encrypted messages scratched onto wax tablets or hidden in hollow spear shafts. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, it wasn't just boldness that fueled his gamble, it was whispers from allies in Pompey's inner circle, confirming his enemies' unpreparedness. Yet some of the most brilliant intelligence coups relied on sheer psychology. During the Peloponnesian War, Spartan general Brasidas intercepted an Athenian messenger, but instead of killing him, he fed the man false details about troop deployments, then let him escape. The misinformation that reached Athenian commanders led them straight into a trap at Amphipolis. This wasn't just lying, it was weaponized trust, turning the enemy's own communication lines against them. Even animals got drafted into ancient spy games. Persians used carrier pigeons, while Han Dynasty scouts tied written reports to train dogs' collars to slip past blockades. The genius lay in understanding that information moved faster than armies, and whoever controlled that flow held the real power. Modern cybersecurity experts would recognize these tactics instantly. Phishing scams mirror Brassidas's deception, while encrypted apps are just digital versions of those hollow Roman spears. The tools change, but the game remains the same because winning a war isn't just about fighting better. It's about knowing more. Hannibal didn't just defeat Rome at Cannae. He rewrote the rules of engagement by treating the battlefield like a living chessboard. The year was 216 BC, and the Roman Republic sent 80,000 men to crush his outnumbered Carthaginian force. Conventional wisdom said frontal assaults were suicide against such odds. But Hannibal saw something others missed. The deceptively open plains near the Aufidus River weren't just neutral ground, they were a canvas for deception. His genius lay in manipulating space itself. Instead of meeting Rome's legions head-on, he arranged his infantry in a crescent, deliberately letting the center bulge outward before feigning retreat. The Romans, sensing weakness, pushed deeper into what seemed like a collapsing line, only to find themselves enveloped as Hannibal's elite African troops swung in from the flanks like steel jaws snapping shut. The flat terrain, which should have favored Rome's superior numbers, became a death trap. Tightly packed legionaries couldn't swing their swords as Carthaginian cavalry circled behind, sealing the kill box. By day's end, 50,000 Romans lay dead in history's most devastating encirclement. What makes Cannae timeless isn't just the tactic, it's the deeper lesson about turning environment into an ally. Hannibal didn't need mountains or forests to ambush. He crafted illusion on flat land by understanding how movement distorts perception. Modern militaries still dissect this battle, recognizing that terrain isn't just hills and rivers, it's the space between soldiers, the angles of advance, even the way sunlight glances off dust to obscure troop positions. Special forces today train to hug terrain invisible to satellites, just as Hannibal's men used the very flatness Rome trusted against them. But here's the twist: Cannae's brilliance was also its curse. Hannibal won the battle but lost the strategic war because he couldn't replicate that perfect storm of terrain, timing, and enemy overconfidence elsewhere. That paradox lingers in boardrooms and sports strategies alike, a reminder that no tactic, no matter how flawless, guarantees long-term victory if the larger system can't adapt. The real mastery, knowing when to break the mold you once perfected. Darkness transformed ancient battlefields into theaters of terror, where shadows hid not just movement but amplified every whisper of threat into paralyzing dread. The Romans understood this primal power when they launched their infamous night raid against King Perseus's Macedonian camp during the Third Macedonian War. While daytime clashes relied on formations and discipline, nocturnal strikes weaponized chaos itself. Picture legionaries slipping through the blackness, extinguishing watchfires one by one before descending on sleeping soldiers, their confusion magnified by the sheer disorientation of being roused to violence in pitch black. The Macedonians, famed for their formidable phalanx, found their drilled precision useless when they couldn't even see who or how many were attacking. Yet night warfare wasn't just about surprise. It exploited psychological vulnerabilities hardwired into human instinct. The Assyrians, centuries earlier, had mastered this art, timing their assaults to coincide with the moon's waning phase when visibility reached its lowest. Soldiers already on edge from sleepless nights guarding against phantom threats would face real enemies at their most exhausted. the Aetolians took it further, attaching bronze clappers to their spears during nocturnal raids, an ancient predecessor to psychological operations. The metallic clangor echoing through camps turned every rustle of wind into an imagined ambush, eroding morale long before blades ever clashed. What made these tactics so devastating wasn't just the element of surprise, but their lingering aftermath. A daytime defeat could be rationalized, flanked, outnumbered, outmaneuvered, but a night attack left survivors questioning their own senses. Had the enemy truly vanished, or were they still lurking beyond the torchlight? The Tang Dynasty general Li Jing capitalized on this paranoia during his campaigns, ordering troops to light extra campfires after nighttime withdrawals, tricking foes into believing his army remained encamped and watchful. Modern militaries still train for night operations, not just for tactical advantage, but because darkness remains one of the few battlefields where perception distorts as lethally as any weapon. Perhaps that's the most enduring lesson. In the absence of light, fear grows unchecked, and sometimes the most powerful army isn't the one that strikes hardest, but the one that leaves its enemies afraid to close their eyes. Cleopatra understood that empires weren't just won on battlefields, they were built in whispered conversations and sealed with signatures rather than swords. Her romance with Julius Caesar wasn't just personal, it was geopolitics in silk and perfume. By aligning with Rome's most powerful man, she transformed Egypt from a vulnerable kingdom into a protected client state, trading gold for legions. But here's the twist: when Caesar fell, she didn't retreat, she pivoted, weaving the same web with Mark Antony. Their partnership wasn't love at first sight, it was a calculated merger, blending Egyptian grain with Roman military might to dominate the Eastern Mediterranean. The lesson: alliances could be deadlier than armies. While Antony's rivals saw a scandal, Cleopatra saw a shield, one that kept her throne secure until the tides of fortune turned. The Delian League took this concept further, proving that coalitions could outlast even the mightiest solo powers. Athens didn't just recruit allies after the Persian Wars, it built a naval empire disguised as a mutual defense pact. Member states paid tribute not into a shared treasury, but directly to Athens, funding the very ships that enforced their loyalty. This wasn't diplomacy, it was institutionalized leverage. The League's strength lay in its illusion of choice: join voluntarily or face Athens' wrath for the collective good. Yet the system worked. When Persia threatened again, the League's combined fleets didn't just defend Greece. They pushed the superpower of the age back across the Aegean. But alliances had a dark underbelly. The Aetolian League, a rival coalition, learned this when they invited Rome to help against Macedon, only to watch their saviors turn into permanent occupiers. History's pages are littered with such cautionary tales. Partnerships that began as lifelines often became chokeholds. The Phoenician city-states thrived through trade networks until Assyria absorbed them as tax provinces. Even Sparta's Peloponnesian League, forged to counter Athenian ambition, collapsed under the weight of mistrust after victory. What separates the successful alliances from the disastrous ones? Flexibility. Cleopatra's mistake wasn't picking sides. It was failing to abandon a sinking ship when Antony lost at Actium. Meanwhile, lesser-known players like Rhodes mastered the art of neutrality, playing Ptolemaic Egypt against Seleucid Syria to maintain independence for centuries. The takeaway: ancient kings and generals knew something modern leaders still grapple with. No empire stands alone, but the smartest powers treat every handshake as a contingency plan, one that might need unraveling before the ink even dries. Walls and armies weren't the only ways to break a civilization. Sometimes the quietest weapons cut deepest. Ancient empires mastered the art of economic warfare long before modern sanctions, using trade routes like garrotes to choke rivals into submission. Carthage learned this brutally after the Punic Wars, when Rome didn't just defeat their navy, they suffocated their economy. The terms were simple yet devastating. Carthage couldn't raise an army without Roman permission, and their once mighty merchant ships were barred from trading with Rome's allies. No battles, no sieges, just a slow, calculated strangulation of wealth. Within decades, a city that had rivaled Rome's power was reduced to begging for scraps, proving that gold could bleed an enemy drier than any sword. But economic sieges took many forms. Athens turned the Delian League's treasury into a weapon, forcing member states to pay protection money or face sudden piracy along their trade routes. The message was clear: pay up or watch your grain shipments vanish. Even spices became instruments of war. When the Nabateans controlled the frankincense routes, they didn't just tax caravans, they manipulated scarcity, driving up prices for enemies while keeping allies flush with the ancient world's most coveted luxury. The most ingenious tactics, though, targeted necessities rather than luxuries. During the siege of Megara, Athens poisoned the city's only freshwater spring with hellebore roots, forcing surrender without a single assault. The Byzantines later perfected this, using their control of the Bosphorus to levy tolls on grain shipments bound for Constantinople's rivals. Starvation, it turned out, was cheaper than siege engines and far more demoralizing. Modern parallels are everywhere, from oil embargoes to digital payment blockades. But here's what the ancients understood that we often forget: economic warfare works best when it's invisible. A soldier sees the enemy across the field. A merchant never knows whose hand is tipping the scales until his coffers run dry, and by then it's already too late. Alexander didn't just command his army, he became its beating heart. While other kings plotted battles from distant tents, he fought shoulder to shoulder with his men, the first over enemy walls and the last to retreat. At the Battle of Granicus, he charged straight into Persian ranks wearing a gleaming white plume, an irresistible target that rallied his troops while daring the enemy to strike him down. That plume wasn't just decoration, it was a beacon signaling something rare in ancient warfare, a leader who shared every risk. Soldiers didn't follow him out of obligation, but because they believed no one else could lead them to such glory. Yet charisma alone couldn't sustain an empire. Alexander mastered the subtle art of morale through gestures modern leaders still emulate. After the grueling march through the Gedrosian desert, he ordered his own rations distributed to starving troops, a sacrifice that turned near mutiny into unshakable loyalty. He memorized hundreds of soldiers' names, celebrating their wounds in public and mourning their deaths as personal losses. When his horse Bucephalus died in battle, he founded a city in its honor, showing his men that even their mounts mattered. These weren't empty theatrics, they were psychological anchors, transforming an army of mercenaries and conscripts into a family bound by something deeper than pay. The contrast with his rivals was stark. Persian kings like Darius expected obedience from gilded thrones, their authority radiating downward through layers of officers. Alexander's power flowed the other way, earned upward through mud, blood, and shared hardship. That difference became his ultimate weapon. At Gaugamela, when his outnumbered forces faced Darius's chariots and war elephants, it wasn't tactics alone that won the day. It was the unspoken promise in every soldier's heart: if their king could charge into certain death, so could they. History remembers the battles but forgets the quieter truth. Empires rise and fall on the strength of belief. The phalanx that marched to the ends of the earth didn't do it for land or gold, they did it because one man convinced them they were invincible. 2,000 years later, that lesson lingers. Whether in boardrooms or barracks, the most powerful leaders understand something Alexander knew instinctively: loyalty isn't taken. It's forged in the fire of shared struggle, one act of trust at a time. Augustus didn't just rule Rome, he rewrote reality itself. While lesser leaders relied on fear to cement power, he mastered something far more enduring: the art of controlling stories. Walk through the Roman Forum today, and you'll still see his propaganda carved into marble monuments depicting him as the pious restorer of peace, the chosen heir of Julius Caesar, the divine architect of a golden age. Every statue, every coin stamped with his profile, even the very calendar renamed in his honor, August, wasn't just a month. It was a branding exercise served one purpose: to weave a narrative so compelling it drowned out dissent before it could form. But Augustus's genius lay in subtlety. Unlike the crude boasts of warlords past, his messaging worked like slow-acting poison. Take the Res Gesti, his autobiographical inscription displayed across the empire. On the surface, it reads like a humble account of public service funding temples, feeding the poor, refusing dictatorship. Between the lines, a masterclass in framing. By listing his titles not as seizures of power but as honors bestowed by the Senate and people, he transformed autocracy into consensus, the lesson. True influence isn't about forcing obedience, it's about making people believe they chose it. This wasn't unique to Rome. Persian kings like Darius the Great etched their victories onto cliff faces at Behistun, ensuring travelers for centuries would see their version of events first. The Assyrians turned palace walls into comic book-style murals, depicting enemies groveling at their feet, psychological warfare for visitors before negotiations even began. Even Cleopatra, during her showdown with Octavian, minted coins showing herself as the goddess Isis, framing her political struggle as a cosmic battle between order and chaos. Fast forward to today, and the tools have changed, not the game. Modern leaders still pose for photo ops in front of flags, corporations rebrand crises as opportunities, and social media algorithms amplify whichever narrative gathers momentum first. The through line is clear: whoever controls the story controls the stakes. Augustus knew this better than anyone. He didn't just build an empire, he built the legend of an empire, knowing full well that marble crumbles but myths, those last forever. History often paints ancient warfare as a stage for men, but scattered across the battlefields were women who shattered expectations with iron wills and tactical brilliance. Take Boudica, the flame-haired queen of the Iceni, who turned personal tragedy into a revolt that nearly expelled Rome from Britain. After Roman officials flogged her and assaulted her daughters, she didn't just seek vengeance, she united fractured Celtic tribes under a single banner, burning Londinium to the ground with a force that dwarfed the local legions. What makes her story extraordinary isn't just the scale of her rebellion, but how she weaponized Rome's own arrogance against them. The empire dismissed her as a barbarian widow until her warriors were at their gates, proving that leadership knows no gender when injustice fuels its fire. Then there's Artemisia of Caria, the only female admiral in Xerxes's Persian fleet, who outmaneuvered seasoned commanders with sheer cunning. During the Battle of Salamis, she found herself trapped between Athenian ships and her own allies, so she rammed a friendly vessel, tricking the Greeks into thinking she was one of them. Xerxes, watching from shore, reportedly exclaimed, "My men have become women, and my woman has become a man." Her audacity won his admiration and secured her place in history, showing that naval warfare wasn't just about muscle but the ability to think 3 moves ahead. These women weren't anomalies, they were proof that marginalized voices could rewrite the rules when given even a sliver of opportunity. The Trung sisters of Vietnam rallied peasants against Chinese occupiers in the 1st century, riding elephants into battle and holding territory for years. Thomaris, the steppe queen who beheaded Cyrus the Great after he killed her son, became a symbol of ruthless maternal vengeance. Even in cultures that barred women from combat, like Sparta, figures like Siniska exploited loopholes, winning Olympic chariot races by owning teams, since only men were forbidden to compete. Their legacies reveal a startling truth: ancient warfare wasn't a monolith. Where one society saw weakness, another saw advantage. A woman's presence on the battlefield could unsettle enemies raised to view them as passive, turning psychological shock into tactical edge. Today's historians often debate whether these stories were embellished by later chroniclers, but perhaps that's the point. Whether fact or legend, they endured because they spoke to something deeper, the universal hunger for narratives where the underestimated rise and the powerless flip the script. Because in the end, the greatest weapon any underdog carries isn't a sword or a spear, it's the element of surprise. The Byzantines didn't just fight with swords and spears, they wielded liquid terror that defied the very laws of nature. Picture this: Arab fleets closing in on Constantinople, their wooden ships packed with warriors ready to storm the city's legendary walls. Then, without warning, streams of fire erupt from Byzantine vessels, clinging to the water's surface like demonic serpents. Panic erupts as sailors leap into the sea, only to find the flames follow them, burning even as waves crash over their heads. This was Greek fire, a weapon so devastating its exact formula remains lost to history, a smoky, sticky inferno that couldn't be doused with water, only smothered with sand or vinegar. What made Greek fire revolutionary wasn't just its destructive power, but the psychological edge it gave the Byzantines. Enemy ships kept their distance, terrified of drifting too close to those mysterious bronze siphons mounted on Byzantine prows. The mere threat of it could turn naval battles before they began, as opponents hesitated, knowing no amount of courage could shield them from a blaze that laughed at the ocean itself. Some accounts even describe the flames roaring louder when doused, as if the substance fed on attempts to extinguish it. But here's the twist: Greek fire wasn't just a fluke of war. It was the product of meticulous experimentation, a marriage of early chemistry and military desperation. Byzantine alchemists likely blended crude oil with pine resin for stickiness and quicklime to ignite on contact with water, ingredients that transformed simple fire into an otherworldly weapon. The real brilliance lay in its delivery system: pressurized nozzles that could spray the concoction in arcs, turning ships into mobile flamethrowers centuries before modern warfare. The lesson: innovation in war has always been about more than raw force. Greek fire's mystique became its greatest strength, as rumors of its unstoppable nature spread faster than the flames themselves. Even today, its legacy lingers in modern incendiary weapons, though none have quite matched its eerie ability to burn where fire shouldn't. Because sometimes the most terrifying weapon isn't the one that destroys, it's the one that makes an enemy question everything they thought they knew about the battlefield. 2,000 years may separate drone pilots from Hannibal's cavalry, but the playbook remains eerily familiar. Modern generals might not chart troop movements on parchment, yet they still study Cannae's kill box to design drone swarm tactics, replacing encircling horsemen with quadcopters that ambush from all angles. Even Sun Tzu's doctrine of winning without fighting has found new life in cyber campaigns, where hackers disable power grids with keystrokes instead of siege engines. The tools have changed, but the psychology, that's timeless. Consider how misinformation, once scrawled on scraps by ancient spies, now floods social media at light speed. Russian troll farms didn't invent fake retreats. They just digitized them, luring opponents into toxic debates like Mongol horsemen baiting enemies into traps. And when special forces study Masada's cliffside defenses, they're not just admiring ancient engineering, they're learning how terrain can neutralize technological superiority, whether scaling mountains or navigating urban canyons. Perhaps the most striking parallel lies in economic warfare. Carthage crumbled under Rome's trade embargoes. Today, nations face crypto sanctions and supply chain chokeholds. The Byzantine practice of controlling the Bosphorus to starve rivals mirrors modern blockades of digital payment systems. The battleground shifted from spice routes to fiber optic cables, yet the goal stays identical: cripple an enemy's livelihood before drawing a sword. But here's what the ancients understood better than we do: every tactic has an expiration date. Hannibal's brilliance at Cannae couldn't compensate for Rome's deeper resources, just as today's flashy cyberattacks often fail against societies with resilient infrastructure. The real lesson isn't about mimicking old tricks, it's about adapting their essence. When Ukrainian forces used Starlink satellites to coordinate artillery, a high-tech twist on Roman signal fires, they proved that the art of war doesn't disappear. It just upgrades its operating system. Victory may write the history books, but defeat often holds the sharper lessons. Take the Persian invasion at Marathon, a campaign that should have been an easy win. Their fleet outnumbered Athens 10-1, their infantry was battle-hardened, and their reputation alone sent smaller cities scrambling to surrender. Yet their sheer size became their undoing. Convinced their numbers guaranteed success, Persian commanders landed their troops in cramped marshlands, trapping their own cavalry in terrain where it couldn't maneuver. When the Athenians charged downhill, the Persian ranks had no room to retreat or flank, turning what should have been a show of force into a slaughter. The lesson: overconfidence isn't just arrogance, it's blindness to the details that decide battles. Then there's Crassus at Carrhae, a disaster so avoidable it feels like a parable. The richest man in Rome marched into the Syrian desert with 40,000 legionaries, chasing glory against the Parthians. He ignored local guides warning of the brutal summer heat, dismissed scouts who reported endless plains with no cover, and arrogantly assumed his heavy infantry could overpower horse archers who refused to fight on his terms. The result: Parthian riders circled his formations for days, peppering them with arrows while staying just out of reach. Roman shields grew heavy with embedded projectiles. Men dropped from thirst and exhaustion. By the time the Parthians closed in for the kill, Crassus's once proud army was a stumbling, parched shadow, its commander's head later used as a prop in a Parthian court play. The tragedy wasn't just the loss of life, but how preventable it was. Carrhae wasn't a defeat of strength, but of imagination. The failure to adapt when the rules of the game changed. Even brilliant commanders stumbled when they stopped listening. Hannibal himself, after Cannae, lingered in Italy for years, waiting for Rome to surrender as cities traditionally did after such losses. He didn't grasp that Rome's sheer stubbornness rewrote the playbook. They'd rather lose a dozen armies than admit defeat. His fatal flaw: winning the battles but losing the war of endurance. These stories aren't just ancient gossip, they're masterclasses in humility. Marathon teaches us that no advantage matters if you don't respect the battlefield. Carrhae warns that no amount of wealth or prestige can outmaneuver a refusal to adapt. And Hannibal's long Italian winter proves even genius falters when it mistakes past success for future certainty. The through line: every disaster carries fingerprints not of bad luck, but of human miscalculation. Because in war, as in life, the costliest mistakes are rarely the ones you make in the heat of battle, but the ones you bake into your plans long before the first sword is drawn. War wasn't always a free-for-all of brutality. Even in Antiquity, certain commanders recognized that unchecked savagery could backfire. Cyrus the Great, founder of the Persian Empire, famously spared conquered cities that surrendered peacefully, even preserving local customs and religions. After capturing Babylon in 539 BC, he didn't enslave its people or torch its temples. Instead, he issued the Cyrus Cylinder, a clay decree now considered one of history's first human rights documents, allowing displaced communities like the Jews to return home. This wasn't just kindness, it was strategy. By positioning himself as a liberator rather than a tyrant, he turned potential rebellions into loyal provinces. But restraint wasn't unique to Persia. Ancient India's Arthashastra, a manual on statecraft, outlined rules for humane warfare. Farmers were not to be harmed, wells couldn't be poisoned, and prisoners had to be treated fairly. These weren't vague ideals, they were enforceable codes with penalties for commanders who violated them. Even Sun Tzu warned against excessive cruelty, arguing that burning crops or massacring civilians would only stiffen an enemy's resolve. The irony, these principles often arose from practicality, not morality. A city spared today might supply grain tomorrow. Captives treated well could become allies or ransom-paying assets. Yet the line between honor and hypocrisy was thin. Roman general Scipio Africanus famously returned a young princess unharmed after the siege of New Carthage, earning admiration, while his legions leveled the rest of the city. And for every Cyrus, there was a Tamerlane who piled pyramids of skulls as warnings. What's striking isn't just how these ancient rules mirror modern Geneva conventions, but how often they were ignored when convenience demanded. The siege of Tyre saw Alexander the Great crucify 2,000 defenders along the shore, a grisly message to future resistors. The real question isn't whether ancient warfare had ethics, but who got to define them. Victorious armies wrote the rules, and mercy often depended on whether a foe was deemed civilized. Celtic tribes who practiced headhunting were branded barbarians, while Rome's mass enslavements were framed as orderly discipline. Perhaps that's why these ancient codes still resonate. They force us to confront a discomforting truth. The difference between a war crime and a necessary measure hasn't evolved as much as we'd like to think. It still hinges on who holds the pen when history is written. From the wooden deception of Troy to the calculated destruction of scorched earth, one truth echoes across millennia: warfare's greatest victories weren't won by muscle alone, but by minds willing to bend reality itself. These ancient commanders didn't just see battlefields, they saw chessboards where terrain, weather, and even human fear could be manipulated like pieces on a board. The brilliance of their strategies lies not in their brutality, but in their unsettling relevance. A CEO negotiating a merger uses Sun Tzu's misdirection just as surely as a general feigned retreat. A politician framing a narrative taps into the same psychological playbook Augustus mastered with marble and coin. Even parents coaxing a stubborn toddler into bed might unknowingly channel Hannibal's knack for turning obstacles into opportunities. What makes these tactics timeless isn't their violence, it's their insight into human nature. The same instincts that made Troy's defenders drag a horse inside their walls still make us click suspicious email links today. The dread Greek fire inspired in sailors mirrors the panic of a hacked power grid. And just as Cyrus the Great learned, kindness can be as strategic as cruelty when building loyalty. These aren't relics, they're blueprints. The Phalanx's rigidity versus the Legion's flexibility plays out in boardrooms where outdated companies collapse while agile startups pivot. Scorched earth tactics resurface in industries where firms burn their own assets to ward off hostile takeovers. Perhaps the most haunting lesson is how these strategies reveal our unchanging core. Technology evolves, but ambition, fear, and the hunger for advantage remain constants. That's why Sun Tzu's words still resonate, why Cannae is still studied in war colleges, and why Cleopatra's alliance building feels eerily modern. The battlegrounds have shifted from fields to courtrooms, from siege engines to social media, but the game endures. So as you scroll past these stories, ask yourself, where do you see Antiquity's shadow in today's conflicts? In a rival's clever marketing, a competitor's surprise pivot, or even your own calculated silence during an argument, the past never really left. It just learned new disguises. Drop your favorite ancient stratagem in the comments, whether it's the Parthian shot's lethal deception or Themistocle's naval illusions. And let's keep unraveling history's most enduring game of wits. For more deep dives into how the old world shapes the new, hit subscribe and join us next time as we decode another chapter of history's hidden playbook. The war for wisdom never ends.